Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this Gaming.com video, we're going to be discussing and analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up over the past 24 or so hours. We're going to be starting things out with AMD's ThreadRipper 2990X. That's right, it will not be known as the 2950X after all. Instead, AMD have chosen to slightly change the naming convention, so the 32-core 64-thread processor will indeed be known as the 2990X. Everyone, welcome it! So in this particular part of the video, we're going to be discussing the benchmarks, specifications and overclocking performance of this processor. Hint, it's rather monstrous. So the base clock for this CPU is 3.4 GHz, however, can turbo up to 4 GHz and can hit 4.2 GHz on a single core. So on a H150i AIO, HKE PC tells us that they can actually overclock the processor on all cores to 4.12 GHz, which is pretty impressive. Don't forget this is 32 cores and once again 64 threads. So yeah, it's pretty much double the thread and core count compared to the previous generation, yet the clock speeds are pretty favourable. So in terms of performance then, we're looking at 6109 points. I'm assuming that's stock clocked. However, it does go up to 6399 points if overclocked. Now those results are just absolutely mind-blowing. And according to reports, the 28-core Intel chip managed to score 5912 points. So AMD here are winning sheerly because of the number of cores available to the 2990X. So as you can imagine, the 2970X is going to have 24 cores, 48 threads, but just like the 2990X, we don't know what the pricing information is going to be on these processors yet. Oh, and just for a quick reminder, if you happen to have an X399 motherboard, the answer is yes, you will be able to use your upcoming new processor on this motherboard, but with a caveat. Essentially, the refresh of the X399 is going to have better power delivery. Now, while that doesn't mean that you can put in this processor and it's going to explode the board or the CPU, what it does mean is that overclocking this CPU on a current motherboard could be somewhat hit and miss. So if you do decide to go for a refresh board, then you're more likely going to have better power delivery. Therefore, in theory at least, the processor may be better at sustained higher clock frequencies across all cores compared to if you were to have an older generation board. Of course, I say that without actually having tested it, and well, because reviewers haven't gotten this thing yet, well, yeah, we're all kind of in the dark. I would suggest that if you do happen to have an X399 motherboard, then kind of wait, see what goes on. Of course, then again, you could also sell your current stuff now before the price plummets, but it does, of course, depend on if you've got a secondary rig in the meanwhile. To say that the sheer value proposition for this particular processor is going to be mind-blowing, particularly if AMD can nail the pricing. Of course, there are the inherent weaknesses we've mentioned about the processor. In other words, that the two main processor modules get access to the memory. We've discussed this previously, and so the other two processor modules, which are on the CPU, need to access memory through that. So in other words, let's, for sake of ease, just call them module A, B, C, and D. So module A and B will have direct access to the memory, whereas C and D will have to access memory, and that is RAM, of course, through modules A and B, which we've heard can increase latency and drag down performance, but only in tasks which really ham out the memory subsystem. But this is, of course, just how the X399 platform worked, because it has fewer memory channels compared to what you would see in Epic. So it was just kind of a concession they had to make. Plus, of course, it would eat into Epic sales if everything was as good as Epic. With that said, it's going to be very impressive, and I would hasten to add, wait for benchmarks before you do plonk down your money. But of course, if you get a good deal, that's kind of totally down to you. But in my mind, this is going to be a really interesting product, and I can't wait to see what it's capable of, particularly with a really good cooler and if you kind of win the silicon lottery. Now let's move over to the 8-core Coffee Lakes. Just yesterday I covered the fact that we're going to be seeing the Xeon E's updated to an 8-core Coffee Lake version. Now, just after I put that out, a couple of you messaged me regarding some Ashes of the Singularity benchmark, which actually show an 8-core Coffee Lake processor. Of course, it has 8 cores, 16 threads, and we had previously seen leaks of this in the past, but the clock speeds were a lot lower. of 2.6 gigahertz. Now we have the chip running at 3 gigahertz, which of course is telling us that Intel are getting more confident in the samples and that the engineering samples are coming along rather nicely up until the final release of the chip. We don't know what boost frequencies are, or should I say turbo frequencies to be correct, but of course the 8700K has a base clock of 3.7 gigahertz. I'm going to be very curious to see whether Intel can manage to achieve the same clock speed with whatever we see these chips being called. I'm just, for the sake of this video, going to call it the 8800K. Let's try and get that going, shall we? The Intel i7 8800K has kind of a ring to it. But even if they don't quite manage to achieve the same clock frequencies, the fact of the matter is 8 cores, 16 threads is very awesome from the perspective of us as customers. And I've gone about this quite frequently, but for my money, I'm very grateful that AMD did release the Ryzen 7 range with 8 cores, because it really has given Intel a kick up the butt to increase the core count on the mainstream. As we see future HEDT platforms arrive from Intel, of course, we're hearing about Cascade Lake and other refreshes on X299 and whatever else we see. I'm going to be very curious to see what the minimum core count is on this platform. After all, we did see 4 cores with no SMT on X299, which was probably about the most pointless thing ever. As for the performance of this chip, it's not really worth going through the numbers as yet. For a start, it's only using a GTX 970, and for a second, obviously, we don't know if there's bugs in the silicon which are causing issues in, for example, the performance, and obviously it's only running at 3 gigahertz. Anyway, the main point of this, the take home, is at the very least we are seeing the fact that the chips are getting closer and closer and closer to launch. And just a quick reminder, a refresher if you will, from yesterday's video, I'll link it in the video description. It looks like the Xeon lineup is going to launch first. So it will be based on 1151, but it will launch first of all in the Xeon platform for desktops, and then eventually, well, hopefully not too much later, I'm guessing a month or something, we'll see the i7s or whatever they end up being called available as well for regular customers. Oh, and there was another story that I wanted to briefly touch on as well, because it's more funny than anything. As you're probably aware, the Intel i7 8086K has just been released, and Intel, of course, gave away many of these processors for a competition, basically to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the 8086 itself. Now, if you're the winner of this competition, AMD have an offer for you, well, at least for some of you. For the first 40 people who contact AMD, you can actually trade your i7 8086K for a ThreadRipper 2990X. That's right, AMD are literally offering you a processor which is worth way over 2 to 3 times the value. I say 2 to 3 times because some people are really charging up the wazoo for the 8086K, especially if you have a highly binned processor, but that's a slightly different topic. So AMD have said that they're going to take it away from here when it comes to the x86. They said that they were grateful for everything that Intel have done in terms of the space, but now that they're basically implying that they're the future and are offering the ThreadRipper processor. If anything, it's a genius move in terms of marketing. It's kind of a one-upmanship. And of course, Intel were quite quick to respond, and what they said is basically that, oh, AMD, if you want a 8086K, all you had to do was just ask us and we'd send one to you anyway. Now, I admit, this to me is just a funny. It's not even like, you know, fanboy kind of thing. It's just funny, a little bit of banter between the two companies. However, I will say from the perspective of AMD, they're getting a winner here. Not because, like, I think that they're kicking Intel, and I don't think it's like a disrespectful move from the company, but honestly, it's not really costing them much. I actually think, in a way, it's a bit cheeky, because they're telling us that you're going to receive this processor. I don't have the timeline in front of me, but I'm pretty darn sure it was like 4 to 6 weeks after they receive your sample. So, in other words, you've got, like, essentially, let's take the average of that 5 weeks. So you ship your process to them, and then you'll get the ThreadRipper 1950X. The problem is, I actually think they're kind of being a bit stingy there. I actually think that I'm not being ungrateful or anything, but at the end of the day, I'm not doing this anyway because I don't have one of the processors and I'm not a competition winner. But I do think that they should have instead chosen the 2950X simply because of the release date of that particular processor. And yeah. Now, my personal opinion on this, and this is my personal opinion, this is not based on AMD or Intel or anything like that. I would not actually trade in the processor if I won it. And I know I'm probably going to immediately get angry comments like, oh my god, why wouldn't you do that? You're getting a much better deal, and ThreadRipper, you know, is much better in terms of HETT performance, and it's actually nothing to do with that. If I actually won this processor, which I didn't because I didn't even enter the competition, but if I had have entered the competition, I had have won the processor, if I had bought the processor, which I didn't, I'm not that interested. Well, I can't justify it, to be honest, but for this reason, I would literally not use it. I would literally just keep the darn thing in the wrapper and I would not touch it at all because these processors are going to be very limited in quantity. So personally, I would just not touch it and I would just keep the damn thing because it could have a high resale value in like 5 or 10 years. And to be honest, something like this to me is more of a piece of computing history. And that's not to say ThreadRipper 1950X is a bad product. We actually did a full review on the 1950X and I love the platform. I love the X399 platform. And by the way, I also conducted a full review on the X299 platform and I loved that as well. And I'll try to remember to link them in the video description, but if not, you can search for it on the channel. But it's irrelevant. I think that the reason to buy these processors, honestly, is a piece of computing history. Frankly, if you're only interested in the performance, I would highly suggest that you do not buy the 8086K. I would highly suggest you just buy the 8700K because ultimately it's a better value proposition. But if you want the piece of computing history, then the eyes of an 8086K, it's just something cool, right? I mean, 40 years, just think about that. We've actually had this architecture now for 40 years, which to me, as a tech enthusiast, is just kind of mental. I mean, as much as people do criticize Intel, and sometimes very rightfully so, you have to give them props. They certainly started something then, and I don't think Intel or anyone could have predicted just how influential that darn processor would have been. And of course, there are certainly other things in technology, like the power architecture or the ARM processors we have today. But even so, personally, just for the sake of history and for the sake of owning that piece of history, I personally would not sell it. As tempted as I would be, because, the performance is great, but I would have just said to myself, you know what, I'd prefer the next generational thing. And to own an older processor when the 2950X is going to be coming out pretty soon, of course, the CPU prices are going to go down the 1950X. But kudos to AMD for this because it's generated them a lot of publicity and it was a really good move. And also kudos to Intel for the way they've responded. It's quite funny. With all of that said, hopefully you've enjoyed the video. I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.